The champagne flutes froze mid-air. 300 guests in Valentino gowns and Tom Ford tuxedos stood paralyzed as Derek Montgomery, heir to a Silicon Valley fortune, abandoned his bride at the altar and walked straight down the aisle. Not toward family. Not toward the groomsmen. Toward the quiet stranger in the plain gray suit sitting beside Charlie Ashford, the bride's younger sister, whose hand he'd been holding for exactly 47 seconds. "Sir," Derek said, his voice cracking across the cathedral silence, "I owe you everything." And just like that, the man everyone had dismissed, whispered about, and pitied all evening became the most powerful person in the room. But 3 weeks earlier, he'd been nobody at all, exactly the way he wanted it. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. I love watching these moments reach across the world. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier.
Portland, Oregon. Nathaniel Cross sat in the back corner of Chapter and Brew like a man trying to disappear into the furniture. The bookstore cafe smelled like old paperbacks and burnt espresso, and the mismatched chairs wobbled when you shifted your weight. But it was his. Not in ownership. He didn't own anything anymore. Not really. But in the way a person claims a space by returning to it until the barista stops asking for your name. He'd been coming here every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 months, always at 2:30, always to the same table beneath the fiction section where someone had scrawled, "Reading is dreaming with open eyes," in Sharpie on the exposed brick. His daughter Maya would be at school for another hour, which gave him exactly 60 minutes to sit with a book he wouldn't finish and coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, while he stared at the same paragraph over and over.
Today, the paragraph was about a man who'd lost everything and was trying to figure out if starting over meant becoming someone new or finally becoming who he'd always been. Nate still didn't know which one he was doing. The bell above the door chimed. He didn't look up. The cafe was never crowded on weekday afternoons. A few college students with laptops, a retired couple sharing a scone, the regulars who treated the place like a living room. The sound of footsteps crossed the worn hardwood, hesitated near the counter, then continued toward the back. Toward his table. Nate kept his eyes on his book, a defensive habit he'd perfected over the past 2 years. Don't make eye contact, don't invite conversation, don't give anyone a reason to ask questions or remember your face. "Is anyone sitting here?" The voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Nate looked up despite himself. The woman standing beside the empty chair across from him looked like she'd dressed in the dark. Oversized USC sweatshirt jeans with a hole in one knee, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail with pieces falling loose around her face. No makeup that he could see. Dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many late nights or not enough sleep, or both. She looked exhausted. She looked normal. She looked like she belonged here. "No," Nate said. "Go ahead." She sat down with the grateful sigh of someone who'd been on her feet too long, setting a beaten leather messenger bag on the floor and a plain black coffee on the table. No laptop, no phone visible. Just her and the coffee, and a weariness that seemed to settle into her shoulders like old weight. For a while, neither of them spoke. Nate returned to his paragraph. The man in the story was burning letters from his old life one by one, and the woman across from him simply sat there, hands wrapped around her cup, staring at nothing in particular. It was the most comfortable silence Nate had experienced with a stranger in 2 years. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The college students packed up their laptops. The retired couple left. New customers came and went, and still the woman sat there drinking her coffee in small sips, looking like she was hiding from something just as hard as he was. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever just need to be somewhere where nobody knows your name?" Nate looked up. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the Sharpie quote above his head, but the question hung in the air between them like an offering. "Every day," he said quietly. She nodded just once. "Me too." That was all. She didn't ask his name, didn't offer hers, didn't launch into the story of why she needed anonymity or press him for his. She just acknowledged the shared understanding and went back to her coffee. And Nate went back to his book. And somehow the silence became even more comfortable than before. At 3:15, Nate closed his book and stood. "I have to pick up my daughter from school." "How old?" "8. "That's a good age," the woman said, and something in her voice suggested she actually knew what she was talking about, not just making conversation. "Old enough to have real thoughts, young enough to still think you hung the moon." Nate smiled despite himself. "For now, I figure I've got maybe 2 more years before she realizes I'm just making it up as I go." "Aren't we all?" the woman said softly. He left without saying goodbye, but when he glanced back from the door, she'd turned in her chair and given him a small wave. Not friendly, exactly. More like acknowledgement between two people who'd survived something similar and recognized each other in passing. Nate found himself thinking about her on the drive to Maya's school, about the careful way she'd asked if the seat was taken like she was used to being turned away, about the dark circles under her eyes, and the USC sweatshirt that looked like it had been worn 100 times and washed half as many. About the way she'd asked if he ever needed to be somewhere nobody knew his name. Not "do you," but "do you ever?" Like it was an ongoing condition rather than a one-time occurrence. She'd look like someone hiding in plain sight. He knew the feeling. "Daddy," Maya burst out of the school doors like she'd been launched from a cannon, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, brown braids flying. "We learned about the solar system today. Did you know that Jupiter has 79 moons? 79. That's more moons than days in 2 months." Nate caught her in a hug, breathing in the smell of playground mulch and cafeteria pizza. "That's a lot of moons. Miss Rodriguez said some of them are so small they don't even have names yet. They just have numbers." Lily pulled back her face up to serious with 8-year-old indignation. "Imagine being a moon and not even getting a name. That's not fair." "No," Nate agreed, unlocking the car. "That's not fair at all." They drove home to the small 2-bedroom apartment Nate had rented after everything fell apart. After the divorce, after the media circus, after he'd walked away from the company and the money and the life that had almost destroyed him. The apartment was in an older building with unreliable heating and a landlord who took 3 weeks to fix anything. But it was theirs. No photographers, no board members, no ex-wife's lawyers sending threatening letters about custody arrangements. Just him and Maya, and a fresh start that still felt fragile most days. "Can we have pancakes for dinner?" Maya asked, dropping her backpack by the door with the casual disregard for property that only children possess. "Breakfast for dinner. Revolutionary." "You always say that." "Because it's always revolutionary." Nate headed to the kitchen, pulling out the mixing bowl and flour. "Did you finish your math homework in class?" "It was easy." Maya climbed onto one of the mismatched stools at the counter, swinging her legs. "There's a new girl at school. Her name is Emma, and she has a lizard named Sir Hops-a-Lot. Even though lizards don't hop, they crawl. I told her that's false advertising, and she said that's what makes it funny." Nate whisked eggs and milk together. "Sounds like you made a friend." "Maybe." She traced patterns on the counter with one finger. "She sits alone at lunch like I do." Pause. "Do you think people sit alone because they want to or because nobody asked them to sit together?" The question landed heavier than she probably meant it. Nate set down the whisk. "I think sometimes it's a little bit of both. Sometimes people need space. Sometimes they're waiting for the right person to ask, "Which one are you?" He looked at his daughter, too perceptive, too aware, carrying knowledge that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to carry about how quickly life can change and how hard it is to trust people afterward. "Both," he said, honestly. "Some days I need space. Some days I'm still figuring out who the right people are." Maya nodded, satisfied with this answer in a way she wouldn't have been a year ago. The divorce had taught her that adults don't always have answers, and that sometimes, "I don't know," or both, is the truest response anyone can give. They ate pancakes at the counter while Maya talked about Sir Hopsalot and Jupiter's 79 moons, and the substitute teacher who'd let them watch a documentary about deep-sea creatures during science class. Normal conversation. Normal evening. The kind of ordinary Tuesday that Nate had built his entire life around protecting. After dinner, Maya curled up on the couch with her library book, something about dragons and girls with swords, while Nate did the dishes and tried not to think about the woman at the cafe. But she kept slipping into his thoughts anyway. The exhausted set of her shoulders. The way she'd wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. The question that had sounded less like small talk and more like a password. "Do you ever just need to be somewhere where nobody knows your name?" He'd spent 2 years building a life where nobody knew his name, where Nathaniel Cross was just another single dad doing school pickups and grocery runs and trying to keep his daughter happy in a world that had gotten too complicated too fast. Where he could sit in a bookstore cafe for an hour twice a week and nobody asked him about investments or market trends, or whether he'd seen the latest article questioning his sanity for walking away from billions. The woman in the cafe had looked like she understood that, like she was running from something too. Nate had learned the hard way that the people who understand running are often the ones who've had to do it themselves. Thursday afternoon, 2:30. Nate sat in his corner beneath the reading quote with a different book, something about a detective and a missing heir that he wasn't paying attention to, and wondered if she'd come back. She did. The bell chimed at 2:40. He didn't look up, but he heard the footsteps cross the cafe, heard them pause at the counter for coffee, heard them approach his table. "Is the seat still available?" Nate looked up. Same sweatshirt, different jeans, hair still pulled back. Dark circles, perhaps slightly lighter. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. "Yeah," he said. "It's available." She sat down with the same grateful sigh, setting her coffee in the same spot. This time, she had a book with her, a thick paperback thriller with a bent cover, but she didn't open it. Just held it in her lap like a prop. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then, 15. Nate read the same page 3 times. The woman across from him stared at her book without opening it. "Do you come here often?" she finally asked, then immediately winced. "That sounded like a terrible pickup line. I didn't mean it like that." "Tuesdays and Thursdays," Nate said, rescuing her. 2:30 to 3:15. "The schedule helps." "Helps with what?" "Everything," he said, simply. She nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I'm Charlie." "Nate." They didn't shake hands, didn't exchange last names, didn't launch into the biographical details that strangers usually trade like currency, just first names given carefully like gifts that could be taken back if handled wrong. "What are you reading?" Charlie asked. Nate held up the detective novel. "Something about a missing heir and family secrets. I'm not really following it." Too close to home. The question was perceptive enough that Nate tensed before he could stop himself. But when he looked at Charlie, she wasn't watching him with the calculating interest of someone digging for information. She just looked tired and understanding, like someone who'd asked the question because she knew what it felt like to have fiction hit too close to reality. "Something like that," he said carefully. "You," Charlie held up her thriller. "Corporate espionage and murder. My therapist would probably say it's me processing work stress through violent fantasy. You have a therapist who says things like that. I have a therapist who's been trying to get me to quit my job for 6 months. Charlie set the book on the table. She's probably right, but I'm stubborn. About the job or the therapist? Both. A small smile. What about you? Charlie asked. Any professionals telling you to make better life choices? Nate thought about the lawyers who'd called him insane for walking away from the settlement. The financial advisors who'd sent increasingly desperate emails about preserving his legacy. The former colleagues who'd stopped just short of staging an intervention when he'd traded his penthouse for a 2-bedroom apartment and refused to return their calls. A few, he said. I stopped listening. Good, Charlie said firmly. The people who tell you how to live your life are usually the ones who don't have to live with the consequences. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now. Less like two strangers tolerating proximity, and more like two people who'd recognized something familiar in each other and decided tentatively to acknowledge it. At 3:10, Nate started gathering his things. I have to pick up my daughter. I remember, 8 years old. Still thinks you hung the moon for now. Nate smiled. Hey, Nate. Charlie's voice stopped him halfway out of his chair. Thanks for not asking questions. He understood immediately what she meant. Thanks for not pressing about the therapist or the job, or why she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Thanks for offering the same courtesy he'd needed the chance to be present without being interrogated. Same to you, Nate said. This time, when he left, she didn't wave, but when he glanced back from the door, she'd opened her book and was actually reading it. And something about her posture looked less burdened than it had 40 minutes ago. Maybe it was the company. Maybe it was the coffee. Maybe it was just the relief of sitting across from someone who understood that sometimes people need to hide in plain sight, and that the kindest thing you can do is let them. The pattern established itself over the next 2 weeks. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 2:30 to 3:15. Nate arrived, first claimed their table, ordered his coffee. Charlie showed up 10 or 15 minutes later, always dressed down, always looking exhausted, always settling into the chair across from him with that same grateful sigh. They talked, but only in the spaces between comfortable silences. Small things. Surface things. The kind of information you could share with a stranger without revealing anything that mattered. Nate learned that Charlie worked in finance, family business. It's complicated. And that she'd gone to Stanford for business but wished she'd studied literature instead. That she drank her coffee black because her father had told her adding cream and sugar was weak, and she'd believed him until she was too stubborn to admit he was wrong. That she'd had a fish named Hamlet who died when she was 12 and she'd given him a funeral that included a eulogy and a shoebox coffin. Charlie learned that Nate had worked in tech before, when things were different, and that he read mostly mystery novels because they were the only stories where all the pieces eventually made sense. That he'd taught himself to cook after the divorce because Maya deserved better than frozen dinners, but his pancakes were still the only thing he could make really well. That he'd once believed in second chances until he'd realized some things break too thoroughly to repair. They didn't discuss why Nate had a divorce he couldn't talk about, or why Charlie looked like she was carrying the weight of a family business on her shoulders, or why they both needed a corner booth in a bookstore cafe to feel human for 45 minutes twice a week. Some things didn't need to be said. On the third Thursday, Charlie asked about Maya. What's she like, your daughter? Nate set down his book. He'd finally given up on the detective novel and switched to science fiction. He considered the question. Not the easy answer, not the proud parent response. The real one. Braver than I am, he said finally. When everything fell apart, when we had to move and change schools, and I couldn't explain half of what was happening because she was only 6 and 6-year-olds shouldn't have to understand why their parents hate each other. She just adapted. She made the best of it. She didn't complain about the smaller apartment or the fact that she couldn't do ballet anymore because we couldn't afford it, or that her mom only called once a month. Nate realized he was gripping his coffee cup too hard and forced himself to relax. She just kept going, like as long as I was okay, she'd be okay, which meant I had to figure out how to be okay even when I wasn't, because she was watching. Charlie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft. That's a lot of pressure. Yeah, Nate said. But it's also the only reason I'm still here, the only reason I didn't. He stopped pulling back from the edge of the honesty. It gave me something to fight for. You're a good dad, Charlie said simply. I'm trying to be. That's the same thing. Another silence, but this one felt heavier, like they'd each revealed something that couldn't be taken back, and now they were sitting with the weight of it, deciding what it meant. My family is all about appearances, Charlie said abruptly. Success status, the right schools, the right connections, the right everything. My sister's getting married next month to exactly the kind of man my mother always wanted her to marry. Old money, good name, perfect pedigree. They've been planning it for a year. It's going to be at my parents' estate. 300 guests, orchestra designer, everything. She traced the rim of her coffee cup. And I'm supposed to stand there and smile and pretend it's about love instead of a merger between two families. I'm supposed to wear the dress they picked and give the toast they approved and bring a date who fits the image they've created. Her voice cracked. And I can't do it. I can't stand in that room with those people and pretend anymore. Nate waited. He'd learned that Charlie needed silence to fill not questions to answer. So I come here instead, she continued, twice a week. I sit across from someone who doesn't know my last name or what my family expects or why I'm supposed to care about any of it. And for 45 minutes, I'm just Charlie. Not the Ashford daughter. Not the disappointment. Just a person drinking coffee and talking about fish funerals and 8-year-olds who believed their dads hung the moon. Ashford. The name registered like a bell Nate had been trying not to hear. Ashford, as in Ashford Financial Group. Ashford, as in one of the most powerful investment families on the West Coast. Ashford, as in the reason Nate had left his old life behind, because he'd learned the hard way what happened when your worth was measured in market value instead of human terms. He should have known. Should have put together the exhaustion and the family pressure and the desperate need for anonymity. Should have recognized that the only people who need to disappear this badly are the ones everyone wants a piece of. But he said nothing, because if he acknowledged what he'd figured out, she'd know he knew, and then this fragile space they'd created would collapse. She'd become Charlie Ashford instead of just Charlie, and he'd become Nate, who recognized her instead of Nate, who shared her table twice a week, and they'd both lose the only place where they could be nobody. For what it's worth, Nate said carefully, you seem pretty good at being just Charlie. She looked at him, then really looked, and something passed between them, recognition maybe, or gratitude, or the shared understanding of two people who'd both learned that sometimes the greatest kindness is not saying all the things you know. Thanks, Charlie said softly. Tiếp tục phần tiếp theo với logic viết tương tự trước đó. Phản bạ. Phần 2, Mein Orchestrated Part 3. Narrative structure with climactic wedding revelation scene. User muốn tôi viết tiếp. Phản bạ của câu chuyện. Dựa vào outline đã tạo phản bạ. The perfect storm have 502 mục đích. To invitation đến wedding climax với danh tính below conflict bùng nổ. Phần 3 bao gồm Act 3A, The Invitation. 802 Act 3B, Preparation. 402 Act E3C. The Ashford Wedding Hen. 302. Tội cản. Giữ nguyên phong cách Việt như phần 1 và 2 liền mạch từ phần 2. Không dùng em dash. Không nhã hàng phần sau. Không tổng kết đạo đức. Không emoji hashtag tống 2.500 từ. Bắt đầu từ scene Charlie vắng mặt ở cafe, rồi đến lời mời chuẩn bị và đám cưới với climax khi Derek nhận ra Nate. Part D. The Perfect Storm. The Tuesday before her sister's wedding, Charlie didn't show up. Nate sat in their corner booth from 2:30 until 3:45, his coffee going cold, his book unopened. He told himself there were 1,000 reasons she might miss their meeting. Work crisis, family obligation, something as simple as traffic, or a migraine, or a calendar conflict. But he knew better. He'd seen the way she'd been holding herself tighter over the past week. The way the dark circles under her eyes had deepened. The way she'd been drinking her coffee faster, like she was trying to squeeze every second from their time together before something ended. The wedding was in 4 days. Charlie Ashford was probably being fitted for a dress she didn't want to wear, and rehearsing a toast she didn't want to give, and navigating family expectations that were crushing her under their weight. And Nate, who'd built his life around not getting involved in other people's problems, found himself worried. Thursday, he arrived at 2:15 instead of 2:30, ordered 2 coffees, both black, claimed their table and waited. She didn't come. At 3:00, Nate pulled out his phone and stared at it. They'd never exchanged numbers, never made plans beyond the unspoken Tuesday-Thursday agreement, never suggested meeting anywhere else or staying in touch between their cafe sessions. To contact her now would be crossing a line, would be admitting that this thing between them had become something more than 2 strangers sharing comfortable silence. He put his phone away. At 3:30, the bell above the door chimed. Charlie walked in like she was forcing herself through each step. Different clothes this time. Business casual. Slacks and a blouse. Hairstyled instead of pulled back. She looked polished, put together, expensive. She looked miserable. "I'm sorry," she said, dropping into the chair across from him. No coffee, no book, just her and the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her like heat. "I couldn't get away earlier. Everything's been..." She pressed her hands against her face. "I shouldn't have come. I should be at the estate helping with final preparations, but I just needed..." "Coffee," Nate said, sliding the second cup across the table. Black, still warm. Charlie lowered her hands and stared at the cup like he'd offered her salvation. "You waited..." "Yeah. You didn't have to. I know." She wrapped both hands around the coffee and took a long drink, and Nate watched something in her shoulders finally unclench. They sat in silence for 5 minutes, 10, and slowly the person across from him stopped being Charlie Ashford in business casual and started being just Charlie again. "The wedding's Saturday," she finally said. "I know. How did you..." She stopped. "Right, I told you about it." "You did." Another silence. Charlie turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I still don't have a date. Mother's been introducing me to suitable options all week. Men from the right families with the right backgrounds." She laughed, but it sounded broken. "Every single one of them talks about portfolios before they ask my name. She doesn't understand why I can't just pick one, why I can't just show up with someone impressive and play my part." Nate understood. Charlie Ashford's +1 at her sister's wedding wouldn't be a date. It would be a statement. A signal about her priorities, her choices, her place in the family hierarchy. Bringing the wrong person would be a rebellion. Bringing no one would be a failure. Either way, she couldn't win. What if... Nate heard himself say, "You brought someone completely unexpected." Charlie looked up. What? Someone who doesn't fit. Someone your mother would never approve of. Someone who makes it absolutely clear that you're not playing by their rules anymore. He met her eyes. Someone like me. The words hung between them like a challenge. Nate couldn't believe he'd said them out loud. Couldn't believe he was offering to walk into exactly the kind of situation he'd spent 2 years avoiding. A room full of wealthy people and their judgment, cameras and questions, the risk of being recognized. But Charlie was staring at him like he'd just offered to slay a dragon, and Nate realized with uncomfortable clarity that he meant it. That for this person who'd given him 45 minutes of peace twice a week without asking for anything in return, he'd willingly walk back into the fire. Nate, you don't... Charlie's voice was shaking. You don't know what you're offering. My family, that world, it's not kind to people who don't fit. They'll judge you. They'll dismiss you. They'll make assumptions and comments, and they won't even try to hide it because people like that believe they're entitled to their opinions about everyone else. I know exactly what I'm offering, Nate said quietly. I've been in rooms like that before. I know how they work, and I'm telling you that if you want someone in your corner on Saturday, someone who doesn't care about impressing your mother or networking with your father's colleagues, someone who's there because you asked, I'll do it. Charlie's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. Why? Because you've given me Tuesdays and Thursdays for 3 weeks and never once asked me why I needed them. Because you understand what it's like to need somewhere to hide. Because, Nate stopped, then decided to just say it. Because I think you could use a friend. And I know I could too. For a long moment, Charlie just looked at him. Then she reached across the table and squeezed his hand once, quick and grateful. Okay, she whispered. Okay, thank you. They sat there for another hour long past Nate's usual pickup time. He texted his neighbor to grab Maya from school. Emergency. Would explain later. Please. They didn't talk about the wedding again. Didn't plan what he'd wear or how they'd handle her family or what story they'd tell about how they met. Instead, they just sat together in their corner booth while the cafe grew busy with the after-work crowd, and Nate held Charlie's hand across the table and hoped like hell he hadn't just made the biggest mistake of his carefully reconstructed life. Friday morning, Nate stood in front of his closet and confronted the reality of what he'd agreed to. The hangers held exactly 3 dress shirts, 2 pairs of slacks, and 1 suit. Charcoal gray, bought on sale 4 years ago for a job interview that had never happened. He pulled the suit out and held it up to the morning light streaming through his bedroom window. The fabric was fine. Not expensive, but fine. Professional enough for a parent-teacher conference or a court appearance. Probably not fine enough for an Ashford family wedding. Daddy, why are you holding your interview suit? Maya appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair a wild tangle from sleep. I have to go to a wedding tomorrow, Nate said, hanging the suit on the back of his door. I'm trying to figure out if this is appropriate. Whose wedding? A friend's sister. Maya tilted her head, considering this information with the seriousness of a judge reviewing evidence. Is your friend the coffee lady? Nate turned to look at his daughter. What coffee lady? The one you think about on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You get this look on your face during breakfast like you're already gone even though you're still sitting there. Then you come home after pickup and you seem less... She waved her hand vaguely. Less like you're carrying something heavy. Nate sat down on the edge of his bed, momentarily derailed by the observation. 8 years old, and she could read him like one of her library books. Yeah, he admitted. Her name is Charlie, and yes, I met her at the cafe. Is she nice? Very nice. Then the suit is fine. Maya walked over and patted his knee with the confidence of someone who'd settled the matter. If she's really your friend, she won't care what you're wearing. And if she does care, then she's not really your friend, and you shouldn't go to her sister's wedding anyway." "That's very wise," Nate said. "I know." Maya headed back toward the kitchen. "Can we have waffles for breakfast?" "We had pancakes 3 days ago. Waffles are structurally different from pancakes, Daddy. They have little squares that hold the syrup. That's engineering, not repetition." Nate followed his daughter into their small kitchen, thinking about how she'd somehow grown up when he wasn't looking. How she'd learned to see through his careful pretending to notice when he was carrying weight and when someone had helped him set it down. How she'd absorbed the lesson he'd been trying to teach her, that kindness mattered more than appearances, and was now teaching it back to him. He made waffles. Maya drowned hers in syrup and told him about the book she was reading where dragons lived in a library and protected stories instead of gold. Nate listened and tried not to think about tomorrow, about walking into a world he'd deliberately left behind, about the risk he was taking for someone he'd known for less than a month. But mostly he thought about Charlie's face when he'd offered, the way she'd looked at him like he'd handed her a lifeline instead of just a date to an uncomfortable family obligation, the way her hand had felt in his, desperate and grateful and trusting in a way that made his chest ache. After breakfast, Nate walked Maya to school and then drove to the one decent men's store in their neighborhood, the kind of place that sold suits to high school seniors going to prom and young professionals buying their first interview outfit. The sales associate was maybe 23, wearing a name tag that said Kevin, and he took one look at Nate's jeans and old sweater and made exactly the kind of assumptions Nate had gotten used to over the past 2 years. "Can I help you find something?" Kevin's tone was polite, professional, and completely disinterested. "I need a suit for a wedding," Nate said. "Tomorrow. Something appropriate for black tie." Kevin's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Black tie is typically tuxedos, sir. We don't rent formal wear, but I can show you our suit selection." "I'm not looking to rent. I need to buy." Nate pulled out his wallet, extracting one of the credit cards he'd kept active for emergencies. Not the platinum card that had once given him access to private lounges and concierge services, just a regular card with a reasonable limit. "What do you have that would work?" 15 minutes later, Nate stood in front of a 3-way mirror wearing a navy suit that fit better than anything he'd owned in years. Kevin had turned out to be surprisingly competent once he'd realized Nate was serious, pulling together a complete outfit with the efficiency of someone who actually enjoyed his job. "This works," Kevin said, adjusting the jacket's shoulders. "The navy is versatile. The cut is modern without being trendy. With the white shirt and this tie," he held up a silk tie in deep blue. "You'll fit in anywhere from a garden party to a cathedral wedding." Nate looked at himself in the mirror. The suit was good. Better than good. It made him look like someone who had his life together. Someone who belonged in rooms with crystal chandeliers and string quartets. Someone he used to be. "I'll take it," Nate said. The total came to just under $800. Nate handed over his card and tried not to think about how that represented most of his carefully maintained emergency fund. Tried not to calculate how many grocery trips or school supplies or unexpected car repairs he was gambling on this one evening. Kevin processed the payment and carefully packed everything into a garment bag. "Big wedding?" he asked conversationally. "Something like that." "Well, you'll look great. Whoever she is, she's lucky." Nate accepted the garment bag and the shoebox. "Thanks." He drove home with his purchases hanging in the back seat and his stomach in knots. This was insane. He was spending money he didn't have to attend a wedding for people he'd never met, all because a woman he'd known for 3 weeks had looked at him with desperate eyes and asked for help. Except that wasn't quite true. Charlie hadn't asked for help. She'd shared her pain, and Nate had offered assistance because that's what decent people did. And then she'd tried to talk him out of it, tried to protect him from the judgment and the scrutiny, and he'd insisted anyway because somewhere in the past 3 weeks these Tuesday-Thursday meetings had stopped being about comfortable silence and started being about actual friendship. Real friendship. The kind where you showed up even when it was hard. Nate carried the garment bag inside and hung it carefully in his closet next to his old interview suit. 2 suits now. A whole wardrobe of options for events he never attended and places he no longer went. Tomorrow, that would change. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nate, it's Charlie. I got your number from the cafe's customer loyalty list. I hope that's okay. I know this is last minute, but I wanted to make sure you have the address. The wedding starts at 4:00. I can pick you up at 2:30 if that works. We should arrive together." Nate stared at the message. Charlie Ashford had tracked down his phone number through the cafe's customer records, which meant she'd either asked the barista or more likely had access to systems and databases that most people didn't. Reminded him again exactly who she was and what world she came from. He typed back, "Address works. I'll drive myself and meet you there at 3:45. Might be easier." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Are you sure?" "It's a bit of a drive. The estate is in Atherton." Atherton, of course. Where else would the Ashford family hold a wedding but in one of the wealthiest zip codes in California, I'm sure. "Send me the address." "Thank you, Nate. For all of this, I know what I'm asking. See you tomorrow." Nate set his phone down and walked to his bedroom window. Outside, the afternoon sun illuminated their quiet street. Modest houses, older cars, kids riding bikes on the sidewalk. His world. The one he'd chosen when he'd walked away from everything else. Tomorrow, he'd step back into the other world. Temporarily. Just long enough to stand beside Charlie while she faced her family. Just long enough to be the shield she needed against their judgment and expectations. Then he'd come home. Back to Maya and waffles and the apartment with unreliable heating. Back to being Nathaniel Cross' single dad, nobody special. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like he was trying to convince himself of something he wasn't sure he believed anymore. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made people believe in divine timing. Clear, blue sky temperature in the mid-60s, leaves just beginning to turn golden red on the trees. Nate dropped Maya off at his neighbor's house for an overnight stay. Mrs. Chen, retired, teacher, adored Maya. Asked no questions when Nate said he had an event to attend. "You look very handsome," Mrs. Chen said approvingly when she opened her door. "Important occasion," something like that. Nate kissed Maya goodbye, reminded her to behave, promised he'd pick her up tomorrow morning. "Have fun, Daddy," Maya said, hugging him tight. Then quieter. "Don't let anyone make you feel small." Nate pulled back to look at his daughter. "Where did you hear that?" "Nowhere. I just know people sometimes try to make other people feel small when they're in fancy places." She looked up at him seriously. "You're not small. You're my dad, and you're the best." Nate's throat tightened. "I love you, kid." "Love you too. Now go so you're not late." The drive to Atherton took 90 minutes through Saturday traffic. Nate followed the GPS directions through increasingly wealthy neighborhoods. Larger houses, manicured lawns, stone walls, and iron gates. By the time he reached the address Charlie had sent, the properties had spread out so far that you couldn't see one house from the next. The Ashford estate sat behind a gate with an actual guardhouse. Nate pulled up to the security station and rolled down his window. Name, the guard, was professional clipboard in hand. "Nathaniel Cross. I'm a guest of Charlie Ashford." The guard scanned his list, found Nate's name, and nodded. "Follow the drive to the main house. Parking attendants will direct you. The ceremony is in the south garden." The gate swung open. Nate drove through and got his first real look at the world Charlie had been hiding from. The drive wound through manicured grounds that probably employed a full-time groundskeeping staff, past tennis courts and a pool house, past what looked like a greenhouse, past an actual fountain with stone angels. The main house rose ahead like something out of a period drama. White columns, brick facade windows that probably cost more than Nate's entire apartment building. This wasn't wealth. This was dynasty. A young man in a vest and bow tie directed Nate to a parking area where Teslas and Mercedes and Bentleys sat in neat rows. Nate's 8-year-old Honda Civic looked like it had wandered onto the lot by mistake. He parked, checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one final time, and stepped out into the world he'd left behind. The Navy suit looked good. Kevin had been right about that. But as Nate walked toward the main house following signs toward the south garden, he felt the familiar weight of being assessed and dismissed settling over his shoulders. Other guests moved in clusters, women in designer dresses and heels, men in tuxedos and custom suits, everyone radiating the casual confidence of people who belonged in places like this. No one looked at Nate, or rather, they looked through him. The quick glance that categorized him as someone's accountant or lawyer, or maybe a vendor who'd been given guest access. Not someone worth knowing, not someone important. Nate had forgotten how much he hated that feeling. Nate. He turned to find Charlie hurrying toward him across the lawn, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. She wore a dress the color of champagne, simple and elegant, her hair styled in loose waves around her shoulders, heels that brought her almost to his height, makeup that hadn't been there during their cafe meetings making her eyes luminous and her lips defined. She looked beautiful. She looked expensive. She looked like Charlie Ashford instead of just Charlie. But when she reached him slightly breathless, the expression on her face was pure relief. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I know, but I was terrified you'd get here and take one look at this place and run for your life." Charlie gestured at the estate grounds. "I wouldn't blame you. I've been trying to run for years." Nate smiled despite his nerves. "It's very excessive, pretentious. A monument to accumulated wealth and social climbing." She paused. "I was going to say, impressive. That's because you're kind." Charlie linked her arm through his, and Nate felt some of his tension ease at the familiar gesture. "Come on, I'll introduce you to my family before the ceremony starts. Get the worst part over with." They walked together across the lawn toward a terrace, where guests mingled with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Nate could feel the stares now, the subtle shifts in conversation as people noticed Charlie Ashford arriving with an unknown date, the whispers starting like ripples across still water. "That's my mother," Charlie said quietly, nodding toward a woman holding court near the terrace steps. "Victoria Ashford. Steel spine ice water in her veins could negotiate with dictators and win. Try not to let her intimidate you. I'll do my best. And that's my father with her, Richard Ashford. Quieter than mother, but just as ruthless when it comes to family reputation. They've been married 35 years, and I think they've had maybe 3 conversations that weren't about business or social standing." Victoria Ashford looked exactly like Nate had imagined. Tall, perfectly coiffed, wearing a dress that probably sucked more than his car. She saw them approaching, and her expression shifted through several calculations in the span of a heartbeat. Surprise, confusion, displeasure, then smooth neutrality. "Charlie, darling," Victoria's voice was warm honey over cold steel. "So glad you could join us. I was beginning to worry. Mother, father." Charlie squeezed Nate's arm once, then released it to face her parents. "I'd like you to meet my guest. This is Nathaniel Cross." Nate extended his hand to Richard Ashford, who shook it with the firm grip of a man who'd been trained in power dynamics since birth. "Mr. Ashford, thank you for having me." "Of course. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Any friend of Charlie's is welcome. How do you two know each other?" "We met at a cafe," Charlie said before Nate could respond. "We've been meeting there for coffee the past few weeks. Nate has become a good friend." Victoria's eyes sharpened. A cafe? How quaint. Her gaze swept over Nate's suit, assessing and dismissing in one practiced look. "And what do you do, Mr. Cross?" "I work in consulting," Nate said, using the vague description he'd perfected for situations like this. True enough, he did occasional freelance work helping small businesses with strategy, vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. "Consulting." Victoria repeated the word like she was tasting something slightly off. "How interesting. And you live—" "Mother?" Charlie interrupted firmly. "Nate is my guest, not a job applicant. Maybe we could save the interview for another time." Victoria's smile turned glacial. "Of course, darling. I was simply making conversation." She turned to Nate. "Please do enjoy the wedding, Mr. Cross. I'm sure it will be quite memorable." The dismissal was clear. Nate felt himself being categorized and filed away as irrelevant, not worth further attention. It should have bothered him, should have triggered the old anger at being judged and found wanting based on nothing but appearances. Instead, he found himself watching Charlie's face and recognizing the exhaustion there. The way her shoulders had tensed the moment her mother started speaking. The careful neutrality of her expression that hid what Nate now knew was frustration and hurt. This was her life. These people, this place, these constant assessments and judgments. Every day, not just Tuesdays and Thursdays. "Come on," Charlie said quietly, taking his arm again. "Let me show you the garden before everyone sits down." They escaped into the crowd, Charlie nodding at people who called her name, but not stopping to make introductions. Nate followed her lead, acutely aware of the looks they were drawing, the conversations that paused as they passed. The ceremony began promptly at 4. 300 guests settled into white chairs arranged before an elaborate floral arch. The south garden had been transformed into something from a magazine spread. String quartet rose petals lighting that would transition perfectly from afternoon to evening. Nate and Charlie found seats near the back, careful not to draw more attention. Around them, people settled in with the rustle of expensive fabric and quiet conversations. Nate recognized the atmosphere, that particular blend of obligation and performance that defined high society events. Everyone was here to be seen being here, to make connections and alliances, to play their part in the ongoing theater of wealth and status. The processional began, bridesmaids in rose-colored dresses walking down the aisle in careful rhythm. Then the bride, Charlie's sister, blonde and beautiful and beaming in a dress that probably cost what Nate earned in 6 months. She looked happy, genuinely happy. Maybe some marriages in this world worked out. The groom waited at the altar in a perfect tuxedo, his face arranged in practiced composure. Derek Montgomery. Nate remembered. Old money, good family, perfect pedigree. Exactly the kind of match Victoria Ashford would have orchestrated. The ceremony began with traditional vows and readings. Nate watched the couple at the altar and tried to remember if he'd ever looked that confident on his wedding day, that certain about the future he was stepping into. Probably. He'd been young and successful and convinced that love plus wealth equaled happiness. He'd been wrong. Beside him, Charlie sat very still, hands folded in her lap, face carefully neutral. But Nate could feel the tension radiating from her, could see the way her jaw was clenched, could sense the effort it took for her to sit here and watch this performance. He reached over and took her hand, just held it, not saying anything, not making a show of it, just contact, just presence, just, "I'm here." Charlie's fingers tightened around his. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the gesture beyond that squeeze, but some of the tension in her shoulders eased. They sat like that through the rest of the ceremony, hands linked watching two people promise forever, while surrounded by 300 witnesses who would hold them to every word. When the officiant pronounced them married and the couple kissed, the guests applauded with appropriate enthusiasm. Nate applauded too, played his part, smiled at the happy couple, acted like he belonged, but the whole time he was acutely aware of Charlie's hand in his and the way she held on like he was the only real thing in a room full of carefully constructed illusions. The reception moved to an enormous white tent that had been erected on the east lawn. Crystal chandeliers round tables dressed in gold and rose linens, a dance floor occupying the center. A jazz quartet played softly near a stage. Waiters circulated with champagne and canapes. Everything glowed with that particular polish that only serious money could buy. Nate accepted a champagne flute and tried to look comfortable. Around them, guests mingled and laughed and discussed things that people discussed at wealthy weddings, vacation homes, and market trends, and whose children had been accepted to which prestigious schools. Dinner was served, 5 courses each, more elaborate than the last. Nate ate slowly, listening to table conversation that ranged from superficial to borderline offensive. The private equity husband made a joke about the poor that everyone laughed at except Nate and Charlie. The fashion woman complained about her assistant forgetting to pack the right shoes for a trip to Milan. The crypto investors debated which Caribbean island had the best tax shelters. Real problems, real concerns. The struggles of people who'd never worried about rent or grocery bills or whether they could afford their child's field trip fee. Nate felt his jaw tighten. Charlie noticed, of course she noticed, and placed her hand on his knee under the table. Gentle pressure. Solidarity. The toasts began as dessert was cleared. Richard Ashford praising his daughter's grace and beauty. Victoria speaking about family legacy in the Montgomery Ashford Union. The maid of honor telling embarrassing stories that were probably carefully vetted for appropriateness. Then it was Charlie's turn. She stood champagne glass in hand, and for a moment Nate saw real fear flash across her face. Then she took a breath, squared her shoulders, and spoke. Victoria has always been the good daughter, Charlie began, and nervous laughter rippled through the tent. The one who followed the rules, made the right choices, never caused mother stress or father concern. She's perfect, and I've spent most of my life being jealous of that perfection, while simultaneously being grateful someone was doing it right so I didn't have to. More laughter, but this time it sounded surprised, uncertain where Charlie was going with this. But watching Tori today, seeing her marry Derek, I realized something. Charlie's voice grew stronger. Perfection isn't about following rules or meeting expectations. It's about finding someone who sees you, really sees you and chooses you anyway. Someone who makes you feel safe enough to be honest, vulnerable enough to be real. Someone who doesn't care about your pedigree or your portfolio or your potential. Just about you. Charlie's eyes found Nate across the tent, held his gaze. That's what I hope Tori and Derek have found in each other. That's what I hope we all find someday. That one person who matters more than everything else. She raised her glass. To Tori and Derek. May you always see each other clearly. The tent erupted in applause. Charlie sat down quickly, her cheeks flushed, refusing to look at anyone. Nate reached over and squeezed her hand under the table. That was perfect, he said quietly. That was terrifying, Charlie whispered back. Mother's going to kill me later. Worth it, maybe. The band struck up music for the first dance. Derek and Victoria took the floor, while guests watched with champagne and approval. They moved well together, practiced and confident, like they'd been preparing for this performance. When the song ended, other couples joined them, filling the dance floor with designer gowns and expensive tuxedos. Dance with me? Charlie asked, surprising Nate. I should warn you, I'm not very good. Neither am I. Come on. They moved to the edge of the dance floor where the lighting was softer, where they could blend into the crowd. Nate took Charlie's hand, placed his other hand on her waist, and tried to remember the basic steps his mother had taught him decades ago. They swayed more than danced, staying in their small corner of space, while around them more skilled couples glided past. Thank you for being here. Charlie said, her voice nearly lost in the music. For all of this, I know it's been awful. It hasn't been that bad. Nate, your table companion, made a joke about poor people. Okay, parts have been awful, Nate admitted, but parts have been good too. Your toast was incredible. Tori seemed genuinely happy to see you. And, he paused, you were right earlier. You mattered to me too. Charlie looked up at him, and in the soft lighting she was just Charlie again. Not Ashford, not the disappointment daughter, just the woman he'd met in a cafe 3 weeks ago who'd asked if he ever needed to be somewhere nobody knew his name. Nate, she started, then stopped, started again. I think I need to tell you something. Excuse me. They both turned. Derek Montgomery stood beside them, his expression odd, determined and uncertain at the same time. I'm sorry to interrupt, Derek said, though he clearly wasn't. His eyes were fixed on Nate with uncomfortable intensity. But I finally figured out where I know you from, and I think we need to talk. The music continued around them, but Nate heard nothing except the rushing of blood in his ears. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since he'd agreed to come here. The moment his carefully constructed anonymity shattered. The music continued around them, but Nate heard nothing except the rushing of blood in his ears. Derek Montgomery stood there with his hand extended toward the edge of the dance floor away from the crowd, his expression a mixture of certainty and something that looked almost like reverence. This was it. The moment Nate had been dreading since he'd agreed to come here. The moment his carefully constructed anonymity shattered. I don't think we need to talk, Nate said evenly, keeping his voice low. You're mistaken. I'm not. Derek's voice was equally quiet but firm. 5 years ago, my company was 3 weeks from bankruptcy. We'd lost our primary investor. The board was voting to liquidate, and I was 28 years old watching everything I'd built fall apart. He paused. Then an anonymous investor appeared. No face-to-face meetings, all communication through lawyers. Bought enough equity to keep us afloat. Asked for nothing except a silent partnership and complete discretion. Charlie's hand tightened on Nate's arm. Around them, other dancers continued their choreographed movements, oblivious to the conversation unfolding at the floor's edge. That investor saved my company, Derek continued. More than that, he saved my life. I spent years trying to find him, trying to thank him properly. His lawyers wouldn't reveal his identity, said he valued privacy above all else. The only name I ever heard was James Valor. The name hung in the air between them like an accusation. Nate felt Charlie go very still beside him, felt the moment she connected the pieces, felt her realization land like a physical blow. You're mistaken, Nate repeated, but his voice lacked conviction now. I saw a photo once, Derek said. Just one, taken from a distance at some tech conference. The lawyer sent it by accident in an email chain. He met Nate's eyes directly. I recognized you the moment you walked through the receiving line, but I couldn't believe it. James Valor, the ghost investor, the man who saved my company and then vanished standing at Tori's wedding with Charlie Ashford. Derek, Nate's just somehow tightened. This isn't the time or place. You're right, it's not. Derek glanced at the dance floor at his new bride spinning with her father at the guests who'd started to notice their conversation. But I need you to know that I owe you everything. My company, my reputation, My ability to stand here today and marry the woman I love. All of it exists because you chose to help a stranger when no one else would." He pulled a business card from his pocket and pressed it into Nate's hand. "I won't tell anyone. I understand why you disappeared, but if you ever need anything at all, I want you to know that I'm here. You saved me once. Let me return the favor someday." Derek walked away before Nate could respond, melting back into the crowd of dancers and guests. Nate stood frozen, the business card burning in his palm, acutely aware of Charlie standing beside him like a statue. "Charlie, he started. "Not here." Her voice was very quiet, very controlled. "Not in front of everyone." She walked away from the dance floor, moving quickly through the tent toward the terrace doors. Nate followed, his heart hammering, knowing that everything was about to fall apart, but unable to stop it. They emerged onto a stone terrace overlooking the estate gardens. Fairy lights strung through the trees, the sound of the reception muffled behind them. Charlie turned to face him, and Nate saw the exact moment her careful composure cracked. "James Valor," she said. Not a question, a statement. "You're James Valor. It's complicated." "Complicated," Charlie's voice rose. "You're one of the most successful anonymous investors in tech. You walked away from billions 3 years ago and disappeared so completely that people still write articles speculating about where you went. And you've been sitting across from me in a cafe for 3 weeks drinking terrible coffee, pretending to be nobody special." "I wasn't pretending," Nate said urgently. "Nathaniel Cross is my real name. I legally changed it back after the divorce. JV was it was a name I used for business, a way to separate my personal life from the investments. It didn't work." "Didn't work?" Charlie's repeated flatly. "You mean it didn't protect you from becoming famous and wealthy and powerful? I mean it didn't protect me from becoming someone I hated." Nate took a step toward her and stopped when she stepped back. "The money, the status, the influence, it destroyed my marriage. It destroyed my relationship with Maya. Everyone wanted something from James Valor. No one cared about Nate. So I walked away from a life that was killing me." Charlie wrapped her arms around herself, staring at him like she was seeing a stranger. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew this would happen. I knew the second you found out everything would change. You'd stop seeing Nate, who drinks bad coffee and picks his daughter up from school, and you'd start seeing James Valor with his billions and his influence and his ability to save failing companies with a single phone call. And I was right. Look at you. You're looking at me differently right now." "Of course I'm looking at you differently." Charlie's voice cracked. "I trusted you. I told you things I haven't told anyone. I brought you here to my family because I thought you understood what it was like to be judged and dismissed based on appearances. I defended you to my mother, and the whole time you were lying to me. I never lied. You let me believe you were someone you're not. That's the same thing." Charlie pressed her hands against her face, and when she lowered them, tears tracked through her makeup. "I sat across from you and told you about my family's obsession with wealth and status and connections, and you said nothing. You let me complain about my privileged life to someone who's probably wealthier than my parents. Do you have any idea how that feels? Charlie, please." "No." She held up a hand. "I need you to understand something. I brought you here because I thought you were real. Because I thought you were someone who'd chosen substance over status, who understood that wealth doesn't equal worth. But you're not that person. You're just better at hiding than the rest of them." The words hit like physical blows. Nate felt something inside him crack. Felt the careful distance he'd maintained from his old life collapse. "That's not fair. I chose to walk away. I gave up everything to rebuild a life that actually meant something. You gave up nothing." Charlie's voice was ice. "You gave up money you can afford to lose. You still have options I'll never have. You can walk into any room and know that if people discovered who you really are, they'd fall over themselves to impress you. I can't escape my family name. I can't change who I am, but you get to play pretend whenever it's convenient." "It's not pretend," Nate said desperately. "Nate Cross is who I am now. The money's in trusts for Maya. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment and work freelance consulting to pay rent. I'm not playing anything." "You're playing at being normal," Charlie interrupted. "You're slumming it in cafes and cheap apartments because you can, because you know there's a safety net underneath if things get hard. That's not the same as actually struggling. That's just," she made a frustrated gesture, "that's just poverty tourism for the wealthy." Behind them, the terrace doors opened. Victoria. Ashford emerged, her expression glacial as she took in the scene. Her daughter crying. Nate standing there helplessly. The obvious signs of an argument. "Charlie," Victoria said sharply, "guests are asking about you. This is your sister's wedding. Pull yourself together and get back inside." "Mother, not now." "Now." Victoria's voice cut like a knife. "Whatever is happening here can be dealt with later. Right now, you have obligations." Charlie looked between her mother and Nate, something crumbling in her expression. Then she straightened her shoulders, wiped at her eyes, and walked past both of them back into the tent without another word. Nate started to follow, but Victoria stepped into his path. "Mr. Cross," she said, examining him with new interest. "Or should I say Mr. Valor?" Nate's stomach dropped. "Derek told me," Victoria continued, her smile razor sharp. "He thought I should know exactly who my daughter brought as her guest." She paused. Imagine my surprise to learn that the man I dismissed as nobody is actually someone quite significant. "Mrs. Ashford, I misjudged you," Victoria interrupted as if he hadn't spoken. "And I rarely misjudge people. That's quite an achievement." Her expression shifted into something calculating. "Of course, now that I know who you are, I have several investment opportunities I'd love to discuss. My husband's firm is always looking for strategic partners, and someone with your track record." "Stop." Nate's voice was flat. "This is exactly why I changed my name. Why I walked away. Because the moment people know who James Valor is, they stop seeing the person and start seeing the opportunity. You dismissed me when you thought I was ordinary. Now you're courting me because you think I'm useful. Neither version has anything to do with who I actually am." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "The world runs on usefulness, Mr. Valor. The sooner you remember that, the better. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wedding to manage and a daughter to repair." She swept back inside, leaving Nate alone on the terrace with the party, sounds drifting through the closed doors, and fairy lights twinkling in the garden below. He stood there for a long moment, Derek's business card still clutched in his hand, feeling the full weight of what had just happened settle over him. His identity was exposed. Charlie hated him. And despite his best efforts to stay hidden, James Valor had stepped back into the spotlight. Nate pulled out his phone and texted Mrs. Chen that he'd be picking Maya up earlier than planned. Then he walked around the side of the estate to the parking area, avoiding the main tent entirely. His Honda Civic sat among the luxury vehicles like an apology, and Nate had never been more grateful for something ordinary in his life. He drove home through the darkening evening, hands tight on the wheel, replaying the confrontation with Charlie over and over in his mind. Her accusation that he was playing at being normal. Her anger at his deception. Her tears that he'd caused by not trusting her with the truth from the beginning. She was right about some of it. He did have a safety net. He could access his money if he truly needed it. Could return to his old life if circumstances demanded. That was a privilege most people didn't have, but she was wrong about his motivations. He hadn't walked away from wealth as an experiment or a performance. He'd fled because staying meant losing himself completely. Nate had learned the hard way that you could have everything and still be empty. That wealth couldn't buy connection or meaning or peace. That the people who wanted James Valor's money rarely wanted Nate Cross's company. He'd chosen simplicity not because he was slumming, but because he was surviving. But explaining that to Charlie now felt impossible. She'd trusted him with her vulnerability, and he'd kept his past hidden. That betrayal couldn't be reasoned away or justified, no matter how good his intentions had been. Mrs. Chen answered her door, with Maya already packed and ready, her small overnight bag sitting by the entrance. "You're early," Mrs. Chen observed. "Everything all right, change of plans," Nate said, managing a smile. "Thanks for watching her." "Anytime." Mrs. Chen studied his face with the perception of someone who'd spent 40 years reading children and adults alike. Sometimes plans change for good reasons. Sometimes they change because we needed them to. Nate nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Maya bounded over and hugged him tight, chattering about the movies she'd watched and the pizza they'd ordered. He carried her bag to the car and listened to her talk, grateful for the normalcy of her presence, the reminder of what mattered. "Did you have fun at the wedding?" Maya asked once they were driving home. "It was complicated," Nate said, honestly. "Complicated. Bad or complicated interesting? Both." Lily considered this. "Did you get to dance with the coffee lady? Her name is Charlie. And yes, we danced. Did she like your suit?" "I don't know," Nate admitted. "We didn't really talk about the suit." "What did you talk about?" Nate pulled up to a red light and looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. 8 years old and asking questions he didn't know how to answer. "We talked about trust," he said, finally. "About whether keeping secrets is the same as lying. About what happens when people find out you're not who they thought you were." "That sounds sad," Maya said quietly. "Yeah," Nate agreed. "It was pretty sad." They drove the rest of the way in silence. At home, Nate helped Maya get ready for bed and read her 3 chapters of the Dragon Library book Voices, and all until she fell asleep mid-sentence. He sat there for a while afterward, watching her breathe, reminding himself why he'd made all the choices that led to this moment. Everything he'd done, leaving his marriage, walking away from his wealth, building a life from scratch, had been for her. So she could grow up with a father who was present instead of powerful, who measured success in moments instead of markets, who understood that being someone's dad mattered more than being someone important, but tonight had revealed the cost of those choices. The secrets he'd kept to protect his new life had damaged the first real friendship he'd found in years. And now, Nate had to decide whether holding on to his anonymity was worth losing the one person who'd understood why he needed it. He pulled out his phone and stared at it. They'd never exchanged numbers, never made plans beyond the unspoken Tuesday-Thursday agreement. To contact her now would be... What an intrusion. An apology. A plea. He set his phone aside and walked to his bedroom window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Modest houses with porch lights, cars parked in driveways, the occasional dog barking, his world, the one he'd chosen, the one where Nathaniel Cross was just another single dad doing his best. But James Valor had slipped back in, and Nate wasn't sure he could force him back out. The next morning arrived too bright and too early. Nate woke to his phone buzzing with notifications. He grabbed it groggy, expecting spam, or maybe Mrs. Chen confirming next week's schedule. Instead, he found 17 missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, 12 text messages, and 6 voicemail notifications. His stomach dropped. The first text was from Derek. "I'm so sorry. I didn't tell anyone, I swear. It must have leaked some other way. Call me if you need anything. The second was from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Valor. I'm a reporter with Tech Insider. Would you be willing to comment on reports that you attended the Ashford-Montgomery wedding? Our sources indicate... Nate stopped reading. With shaking hands, he opened his browser and searched his name. The results made his blood run cold. Mysterious investor James Valor spotted at California wedding. Ashford family wedding reveals secret guest. Reclusive tech millionaire James Valor, where has JV been? Anonymous investor emerges after 3-year absence. The articles were everywhere. Someone at the wedding had recognized him or overheard Derek's conversation, or simply connected the dots. Someone had taken photos. Someone had contacted the press, and now his carefully constructed anonymity was burning down around him. Nate scrolled through article after article, each one speculating about why he was there, who he'd been with, whether his appearance signaled a return to investing. Several mentioned Charlie by name, noting that he'd been seen dancing with her sitting at her table, arriving as her guest. His phone rang again. Another unknown number. Nate declined the call and immediately dialed his lawyer, the one person from his old life he'd stayed in contact with for situations exactly like this. Nate, David answered on the first ring. I saw the articles. Are you okay? No, Nate said honestly. David, I need you to do damage control. Release a statement that I attended as a personal guest, that I'm not returning to active investing, that my private life remains private. Whatever it takes to make this stop. I'll handle it, David said. But Nate, you need to prepare yourself. The articles are already going viral in finance circles. Your name is trending on social media. People are fascinated by the ghost investor returning after 3 years. This won't die down quickly. Nate closed his eyes. How bad is it? Bad enough that you should probably avoid public places for a while. Bad enough that Maya's school might see increased attention. Bad enough that anyone associated with you is going to get scrutinized. Anyone associated with him. That meant Charlie. The woman already drowning in her family's expectations and public scrutiny, now being dragged into Nate's mess because she'd trusted him enough to bring him to her sister's wedding. Fix it, Nate said tightly. I don't care what it costs. Fix it. He hung up and sat in his bedroom staring at his phone as more notifications poured in. His identity was everywhere now. James Valor was back, whether Nate Cross wanted him or not, and there was no way to shove the ghost back into hiding. By noon, Nate had turned off his phone entirely. The calls and texts had become relentless. Reporters, former colleagues, people he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly desperate to reconnect. Even 2 producers wanting to discuss documentary opportunities about the man who walked away from billions. The attention felt like drowning in slow motion. Each notification another weight pulling him under. Maya found him sitting at the kitchen table staring at his silent phone like it might explode. Daddy, why aren't you answering your phone? Mrs. Chen called the apartment phone. She said people have been coming to her door asking about us. Nate's head snapped up. What people? She didn't say, just that they were asking questions and she told them to leave. Maya's eyes were wide, worried. Are we in trouble? No, baby, we're not in trouble. Nate pulled her into a hug, feeling her small body tense against his chest. Some people found out about my old job and they're curious, that's all. It'll blow over soon. But he could hear the lie in his own voice, and from the way Maya pulled back to study his face, she could hear it too. Is this about the coffee lady? She asked quietly. About what you told her. In a way, Nate said. Sometimes, when you try to keep something private, it makes people more interested when they find out. They want to know why it was secret in the first place. That's stupid, Maya said. Yeah, Nate agreed. It really is. They spent Sunday inside, curtains drawn, Nate monitoring the news on his laptop, while Maya built an elaborate castle from blocks on the living room floor. David called the apartment line twice with updates. The statement had been released, but interest was only growing. Someone had dug up old photos of Nate from tech conferences, creating side-by-side comparisons with the candid shots from the wedding. The internet had become obsessed with his transformation from polished tech investor to ordinary single dad. They're calling it the greatest voluntary disappearing act in modern finance, David said during the second call. There's speculation you're writing a book, starting a new company, suffering from some kind of breakdown. The theories are everywhere. What are they saying about Charlie? Nate asked the question he'd been afraid to voice. David hesitated. Some outlets are speculating about the nature of your relationship, whether she knew who you were, whether the Ashford family orchestrated the meeting for investment purposes. It's not kind, Nate. Nate closed his eyes. Can we sue for what speculation isn't libel unless they make specific false claims? And unfortunately, your appearance at her family wedding has made her part of the story. David's voice softened. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. After hanging up, Nate opened his laptop and searched Charlie's name against his better judgment. The results made him feel physically ill. Ashford daughter's mystery date revealed as reclusive millionaire. Was Charlie Ashford's wedding +1 a publicity stunt? Victoria Ashford denies orchestrating daughter's introduction to James Valor. The articles dissected everything. What Charlie had been wearing, how long they'd danced, the fact that she'd left the reception early. Several included quotes from anonymous sources close to the family suggesting that Victoria Ashford had been furious about Nate's presence, that Charlie had gone rogue by bringing an unapproved date, that the Ashford family was scrambling to control the narrative. One article included a photo of Charlie on the terrace, and Nate's chest constricted when he saw her face. Even in the grainy distance shot, he could see she'd been crying. Could see the moment he'd broken her trust, captured and disseminated to thousands of strangers who would now judge her choices, her emotions, her life. This was exactly what he'd feared, exactly why he'd walked away from being James Valor. Because once you became public property, everything you did became content for consumption. Every relationship got scrutinized, every private moment became potential news, and he'd dragged Charlie into it. Monday morning, Nate dropped Maya at school and drove to Chapter and Brew, even though it wasn't Tuesday. The cafe looked exactly the same. Same mismatched chairs, same Sharpie quote on the brick wall, same smell of burnt espresso and old books. But everything felt different now. He sat at their table with his coffee and his book, and honored the ritual because it felt important. Because it proved his commitment to their friendship hadn't been conditional on anonymity. Charlie didn't come. Sarah, the barista, gave him a sympathetic look during a quiet moment, but said nothing. The retired couple who usually shared a scone asked if his friend was all right. Even the college students who studied in the corner gave him knowing glances. Everyone had noticed. At 3:30, Nate left. The cafe felt hollow without Charlie across from him, like he'd been sitting in a room that had lost its oxygen. Tuesday arrived. The actual day. Their day. Nate showed up at 2:30, ordered 2 coffees out of habit, both black. One for Charlie, who wouldn't come. He sat at their table and waited anyway. 3:15 came and went. 3:30. The coffee went cold in front of the empty chair. He stayed until closing. Thursday, Nate returned at 2:15, claimed their table, ordered their coffees, pulled out his book and pretended to read while watching the door. At 2:45, Sarah approached during a lull in customers. Your friend was here this morning, she said gently. Asked me to give you this if you showed up." She handed him a folded piece of paper. Nate took it with hands that weren't quite steady. Sarah retreated to give him privacy. He unfolded the note, Charlie's handwriting neat and precise. "Nate, I need time to think. I'm not ready to see you yet. I know you probably think I'm overreacting, but this isn't just about the money or the name. It's about the fact that I built a friendship with someone I thought I understood, and now I don't know what was real and what wasn't. I don't know if the person I trusted still exists, or if he was just a character you were playing. I need to figure that out before we can talk again. Please respect that. Charlie." Nate read the note 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his wallet next to Derek's business card and the photo of Maya he carried everywhere. 3 things that represented 3 different versions of himself. The father, the investor, the friend. He'd thought he could keep them separate. Thought he could choose which one to be in any given moment. But Saturday night had proved that impossible. The moment James Valor became visible, he consumed everything else. Nathaniel Cross disappeared. Nate returned to the cafe Thursday afternoon anyway, sat at their table, ordered their coffee, waited the full 45 minutes even though he knew she wouldn't come. It felt important to honor the ritual to prove that his commitment to their friendship hadn't been conditional on staying hidden. The cafe regulars noticed. The retired couple asked if his friend was all right. The college students gave him sympathetic looks. Even Sarah seemed worried refilling his coffee without being asked. "She'll come back," Sarah said quietly during one refill. "People who matter always come back eventually." Nate nodded, but didn't believe it. He'd seen this pattern before. Once people discovered James Valor's identity, they either tried to use him for connections and influence, or they pulled away because the power imbalance made genuine friendship impossible. Either way, Nathaniel Cross disappeared. Charlie was pulling away. He couldn't blame her. He'd let her believe he was someone safe, someone ordinary, someone who understood struggling and rebuilding because he was doing it too. Then she'd discovered he was doing it by choice, not necessity. That he could stop pretending whenever he wanted. That changed everything. Friday afternoon, Nate picked Maya up from school and took her for ice cream, something he only did for special occasions or when he needed to think. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Maya asked, around a mouthful of chocolate chip. "What makes you think something's wrong? You ordered vanilla. You always get coffee flavor. Vanilla means you're upset but trying to pretend you're not." Nate looked at his daughter, too perceptive, too aware, carrying the burden of having a father who tried to protect her from adult problems but couldn't quite hide them successfully. "You're right," he admitted. "I am upset. My friend Charlie, the coffee lady, she found out something about me that I should have told her from the beginning. Now she's angry and hurt, and I don't know how to fix it." "What did she find out?" Nate hesitated, then decided Maya deserved honesty. She'd lived through enough secrets and half-truths during the divorce. "She found out I used to have a different job, that I used to be someone kind of important and well-known. I didn't tell her because I was afraid it would change how she saw me." "Did it?" "Yeah," Nate said quietly. "It did." Maya ate her ice cream thoughtfully for a moment. "When Emma found out you were my dad, she got weird for a few days." "What, why?" "Because her mom had seen you picking me up and told Emma you were really handsome. Maybe Emma should invite me over for a play date so her mom could meet you." Maya rolled her eyes with impressive 8-year-old disdain. Emma was embarrassed. Didn't want me to think she was only being my friend because her mom wanted to meet you. So she avoided me for a while. Nate felt something twist in his chest. "What happened?" "I told her I didn't care why she wanted to be friends originally. I just cared that she was my friend now. that the beginning doesn't matter as much as what you do after. Maya looked at him seriously. Maybe your coffee lady needs to hear that too. That who you were before doesn't change who you are now. And if she's really your friend, she'll figure that out. Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds. Nate reached over and squeezed Maya's hand. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just don't listen enough. But she grinned, removing the sting from her words. They finished their ice cream and drove home through the Friday afternoon traffic. Nate thought about what Maya had said, about beginnings versus middles, about judging people on who they were now instead of who they used to be. It was good advice, mature advice, the kind of wisdom that came from watching adults mess up relationships and learning from their mistakes. But Nate wasn't sure it applied to his situation with Charlie, because the problem wasn't just that he'd hidden his past. It was that his past gave him options and safety nets that fundamentally changed the nature of any struggle he claimed to understand. Charlie was right about that. He was choosing simplicity. She was trapped in complexity. Those weren't equivalent experiences no matter how much Nate wanted them to be. Saturday morning, Nate woke to his phone buzzing with notifications. He grabbed it, expecting more press inquiries or former colleagues trying to reconnect. Instead, he found a text from Derek Montgomery. Nate, I need to talk to you. It's about Charlie. Can I come by your place this morning? I promise I'm not bringing reporters. Nate stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Address is 22847 Morrison Street, Apt 3B. Come whenever. Derek arrived an hour later wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his wedding tuxedo. He looked uncomfortable, standing in the hallway of Nate's modest apartment building like he wasn't sure he had the right address. Nate opened the door before Derek could knock. How did you find my address? I have good lawyers, Derek said with a grimace. Can I come in? Nate stepped aside. Derek entered, looking around the small apartment with poorly concealed surprise. The mismatched furniture, the crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, the lived-in chaos of a single-parent household. This wasn't where people expected billionaires to live, even reformed ones. Maya was at Emma's house for a play date, the first real friendship she'd formed since they'd moved here. Nate was grateful for the privacy. Coffee, he offered. No, thank you. I won't stay long. Derek sat on the edge of the couch like he wasn't sure he should get comfortable. I came to apologize. I know I said I wouldn't tell anyone about who you are, and I didn't. But Tori's maid of honor overheard our conversation on the dance floor. She told 3 people before dessert was served. By the end of the reception, half the guests knew. Someone contacted the press. It's not your fault, Nate said, sitting in the armchair across from him. I should have known this would happen the moment I walked into that wedding. Should have known I couldn't just show up and stay invisible. But you tried anyway, Derek said quietly. For Charlie. Nate didn't respond. Didn't need to. Derek leaned forward, elbows on his knees. She's not doing well, Nate. Tori called me this morning. Said Charlie hasn't left her apartment since Monday. Won't answer calls from her family. The press has been camped outside her building. Nate's stomach dropped. How bad? Bad enough that Victoria Ashford actually apologized to her, publicly. Derek pulled out his phone and showed Nate an article. Victoria's carefully crafted statement about misjudging Nate at the wedding, about recognizing his character and integrity now that she knew his full identity, about being honored that someone of his caliber chose to support her daughter. It was damage control, obviously, trying to spin the narrative so it looked like the Ashford family had known who Nate was all along and approved. The apology was designed to protect their image, not to actually make amends. But it was still an apology, which meant Victoria Ashford had been forced to publicly admit error. That must have cost her. The thing is, Derek continued. Charlie demanded that apology. Tori said she told their mother that either she apologizes for how she treated you or Charlie walks away from the family entirely. No more board meetings, no more events, no more playing the dutiful daughter. Victoria apparently thought she was bluffing until Charlie started packing. Nate looked up sharply. Charlie would give up her family for me. For someone she cared about being treated with basic respect, apparently yes. Derek met his eyes. She's angry at you for not telling her the truth, but she's angrier at herself for caring about your identity once she found out. Tori said Charlie keeps saying she proved you right, that knowing changed everything, and she hates that it did. Nate sat back in his chair processing this. Charlie had defended him, had forced her mother to apologize, had been willing to walk away from everything rather than accept how Victoria had dismissed him, even while angry at him for the deception she'd stood up for him. I don't know how to fix this, Nate said quietly. Have you tried talking to her? She asked for space. She said she needed time to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Nate rubbed his face. And maybe she's right to question it. Maybe I was playing at being ordinary. Maybe having money in reserve does make my choices fundamentally different than someone who's actually struggling. That's bullshit, Derek said bluntly. You walked away from billions to live here and raise your daughter alone. That's not playing. That's choosing. And choosing is harder than having no choice at all because it means accepting the consequences when you could have avoided them. Nate wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that his choices had been genuine, not performative. But Charlie's words echoed in his mind. You're playing at being normal. You're slumming it in cafes and cheap apartments because you can. Easy for you to say, Nate said. You're not the one who lied about who you are. You didn't lie. You just didn't volunteer information that would have changed how people treated you. Derek leaned forward. Look, I spent 5 years trying to find James Valor so I could thank him. You know what I discovered? He didn't want to be found. He didn't want gratitude or recognition or anything except to help without strings attached. That's rare. That's valuable. That's exactly the kind of person Charlie needed in her life. Someone who saw her without wanting something from her. Until she found out I was hiding who I was, Nate said. Then I became just another person with secrets and agendas. Derek stood up, preparing to leave. So, prove her wrong. Prove that James Valor and Nathaniel Cross are the same person with the same values. Prove that your friendship was real even if the name wasn't complete. He paused at the door. Stop hiding and show her who you actually are, all of it. No walls, no protection. That's terrifying. That's the point. Derek opened the door, then looked back. For what it's worth, I think she'll listen. Tori says Charlie's been carrying around your note, the one you apparently left at the cafe last week. Nate stared at him, confused. I didn't leave a note. Then someone's lying, or Tori's confused. But she said she saw it. Several lines about understanding why Charlie was angry and how you were just trying to protect the one good thing you'd found in years. Derek shrugged. Maybe you wrote it and forgot. You've had a stressful week. After Derek left, Nate sat in his apartment and thought about what he'd said. About proving that Nate and James were the same person. About showing Charlie everything without walls or protection. The idea terrified him in a way that walking into the Ashford wedding hadn't. Because this wasn't about surviving one uncomfortable evening. This was about exposing the whole messy truth. The divorce that had shattered him. The loneliness that had driven him to disappear. The fear that no one would ever see past the money to the person underneath. But if he wanted any chance of salvaging his friendship with Charlie, he had to try. Monday morning, Nate called David and asked him to arrange a meeting. Not with lawyers or PR people, just with Charlie. Somewhere private where they could talk without cameras or eavesdropping guests. David promised to reach out through proper channels and call back. While Nate waited, he did something he'd been avoiding for 3 years. He opened his laptop and pulled up the accounts he'd locked away when he changed his name. The investment portfolios, the trust funds, the quiet empire he'd built before walking away. He hadn't checked the balances in months, had let everything run on autopilot through automated systems and trustee oversight. The numbers were staggering. Even after setting aside funds for Maya's future and making anonymous donations to causes he cared about, James' valor was worth significantly more now than when he'd stopped actively investing. Money made money, especially when you already had enough to weather any market downturn. Nate stared at the figures and felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, no sense of security. Just the hollow recognition that this wealth, this power, was exactly what had destroyed his first marriage and corrupted every relationship he'd tried to build afterward. Because people didn't want Nate. They wanted access to these numbers. He closed the laptop and made lunch for Maya. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. They ate together while she told him about the science project she was planning. Something about bioluminescent creatures. Did you know some jellyfish glow in the dark, not to see, but to confuse predators? Maya said, around a mouthful of sandwich. They flash bright lights and the predators get distracted and swim away. It's like a smoke bomb, but made of light, a light bomb. That's a good survival strategy, Nate said. Emma says it's nature's flashbang grenade. Maya grinned. Do you wish you could do that, flash bright lights and make all the reporters swim away? Nate smiled despite himself. Every single day. Well, you kind of did it backward, Maya observed. You made yourself dim so people wouldn't see you. Then someone turned the lights back on. She took another bite. Maybe, instead of hiding again, you should just stay bright, but pick better places to glow. Like only around people who don't care about the light. Just about you. Out of the mouths of 8-year-olds again. David called back that afternoon. I had reached out to the Ashford family's representation. Charlie agreed to meet with you Thursday afternoon, 2:30, at the place you suggested. Nate's heart jumped. She agreed, with conditions. She wants it private. No press, no family, no witnesses. Just you and her, and she wants you to come prepared to answer questions honestly, without deflecting or justifying her words. I can do that. Nate, David said carefully, I've known you for 15 years. I watched you build an empire and then walk away from it. I watched you survive a divorce that would have broken most people. I've seen you at your strongest and your lowest. So I'm saying this as your friend, not your lawyer. Be careful. This woman matters to you. I can hear it in your voice. Don't rush this conversation trying to fix everything at once. Let her set the pace. When did you become a relationship counselor? When my best client started making decisions with his heart instead of his spreadsheets, David said dryly. It's terrifying to watch, but also kind of hopeful. Just don't screw it up. The days between Monday and Thursday crawled past with excruciating slowness. Nate prepared for the conversation the way he used to prepare for high-stakes business negotiations, making mental lists of points to address, practicing honest answers to hard questions, reminding himself that defensiveness would only make things worse. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was an apology, an explanation, a plea for Charlie to see that the person she'd trusted in the cafe still existed, even if his name carried more weight than she'd known. Thursday afternoon, 2:25. Nate arrived at Chapter and Brew early. Charlie was already there. She sat at their table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring at the Sharpie quote about reading being dreaming with open eyes. She wore jeans and an oversized sweater. Her cafe clothes, not her Ashford family armor. But her face looked drawn tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. She looked up when Nate approached, and something complicated flickered across her expression. Not quite anger, not quite welcome. Something in between. "Hi," Nate said quietly. "Hi." Charlie gestured at the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, we need to talk." Nate sat. The table between them felt like miles instead of inches. He wanted to reach across and take her hand off her comfort or connection, but he kept his hands in his lap and waited for Charlie to set the pace like David had advised. "I have questions," Charlie said without preamble, "and I need you to answer them honestly. Not spin, not justification, just truth. Can you do that? Yes. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" The question was direct, uncompromising. "From the beginning, when we first met. Why didn't you just say, 'I used to be someone else and I'm trying to start over'?" Nate took a breath. "Because every time I've told someone about my past, they've changed how they treated me. Either they wanted something from James Valor, investment advice, connections, money, or they pulled away because they couldn't get past the wealth disparity. Either way, Nate disappeared, and I was so tired of disappearing. So you lied to me instead." "I didn't lie. I just didn't volunteer information that would have changed everything between us." Nate met her eyes. "And I was right, wasn't I? The moment you found out, everything did change. You started looking at me differently, questioning whether our friendship was real, wondering if I'd been slumming or playing games. That's exactly what I was afraid of." Charlie's jaw tightened. "You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to decide what information I can handle or how I'll react. That's controlling and condescending, and it's exactly what my family does, filtering the truth so I only see what they want me to see." The comparison hit hard. Nate felt his face flush. "You're right, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to control you. I was trying to protect something I thought was fragile. Our friendship," Charlie's voice cracked slightly. "You thought it was so fragile it couldn't survive honesty." "I thought I was fragile," Nate admitted. "I thought if you knew who I'd been, you'd either want to use me like everyone else, or you'd hate me for having options you don't, and I couldn't handle either outcome. So I kept quiet and told myself it was for both of us, when really it was just cowardice." Charlie stared at him for a long moment, and Nate forced himself not to look away, not to soften the admission with excuses or qualifications. This was what she'd asked for, raw truth, no polish. "I did hate you," Charlie said quietly. "For about 3 days I absolutely hated you. Hated that you'd let me complain about my privileged problems to someone even more privileged. Hated that you'd hidden behind anonymity while I suffocated under visibility. Hated that I'd trusted you and you'd kept this massive secret." Nate nodded, accepting the words, even though they hurt. "But then I kept thinking about our Tuesdays and Thursdays," Charlie continued. "About the way you'd listen without trying to fix things. The way you'd understood what I meant about needing anonymity. The way you'd offered to come to that wedding, knowing exactly what kind of room you'd be walking into." She paused. "And I realized I hated myself more than I hated you. Because knowing your identity did change how I saw you. And that meant I was exactly like everyone else who judges people based on wealth instead of character." "Charlie, no. Let me finish." She held up a hand. "My mother saw you at that wedding and dismissed you as nobody. Then she found out who you were and suddenly you became somebody worth courting. I'd been so angry at her for being shallow and status-obsessed. But I did the same thing in reverse. I thought you were worth knowing when you were Nathaniel Cross. When I found out you were James Valor, I questioned everything about our friendship. That makes me just as bad as she is. That's not true, Nate said firmly. You questioned our friendship because I'd kept secrets, not because of money. That's completely different. Is it, though? Charlie's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Because I keep replaying that night and I can't separate my anger about the deception from my feelings about the wealth. They're tangled together, and I hate that I can't just say, who cares that you used to be rich? You're still the same person. Because it does matter. It matters that you have safety nets I'll never have. It matters that you chose simplicity while I'm trapped in complexity. Those things are real even if they shouldn't change how I feel about you as a person. Nate reached across the table slowly, giving Charlie time to pull away. She didn't. He took her hand carefully like it might break. You're right. Those things are real, and I'm sorry for pretending they weren't. I'm sorry for making you feel like you couldn't acknowledge the actual differences in our situations. That was unfair. Charlie's fingers tightened around his, and for a moment they just sat there holding hands across the table like they had at the wedding before everything fell apart. The cafe hummed with its usual afternoon rhythm, espresso machine hissing, quiet conversations, pages turning, and Nate felt something in his chest loosen slightly. I need to tell you the whole story, Nate said quietly. Not the sanitized version, not the careful explanation. The actual truth about why I walked away and what it cost me, and why I'm so terrified of going back. Okay. Charlie's voice was steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. I'm listening. Nate took a breath and let himself fall into honesty without a net. I met my ex-wife Amanda when I was 26. Just made my first successful investment. Thought I was brilliant. She was beautiful and ambitious, and she saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself. We got married fast, had Maya within a year. For a while, everything seemed perfect. He paused, remembering those early years with the distance that only pain and time could provide. But as James Valor became more successful, Nathaniel Cross disappeared. Amanda fell in love with what I could provide, not who I was. She loved the penthouse and the vacation homes and the galas. She loved being married to someone important. She didn't love me. How do you know? Charlie asked gently. Because when Maya was 6, I told Amanda I wanted to step back, scale down the investments, spend more time with our daughter, try to remember why we'd gotten married in the first place. Nate's voice roughened, and she looked at me like I'd suggested we burn down our house. She said if I walked away from the money and the status, she'd leave me. That I could be James Valor with everything that came with it, or I could be nobody alone. So you chose nobody. I chose Maya. I chose the chance to be her father instead of a wallet with a heartbeat. I chose the possibility that somewhere underneath all the money and power there was still a person worth knowing. Nate met Charlie's eyes. Amanda got the penthouse and most of the liquid assets. I got custody of Maya and the investment accounts I'd kept separate. I changed my name back to Cross, my mother's maiden name, and I disappeared. Found this apartment, enrolled Maya in public school, started freelancing just enough to pay rent. And I've been surviving ever since, learning how to be present instead of profitable, learning what Maya's favorite color is and how she likes her pancakes and what makes her laugh. Learning that the best parts of life are free, playground conversations and library books and Tuesday afternoons in a cafe with someone who sees you instead of your bank account. Charlie was quiet for a long moment, still holding his hand, processing everything he'd said. Finally, she spoke. I understand why you ran. I understand why you kept your past hidden. But Nate, she squeezed his fingers. You can't spend the rest of your life terrified that being honest will make people treat you differently. That's not surviving. That's just a different kind of prison. I know, Nate said. And I'm sorry I put you in the position of having to discover the truth the worst possible way. You deserved better. You deserved honesty from the beginning, and I was too scared to give it to you. Why? Charlie leaned forward. Why were you so scared specifically with me? Nate felt his throat tighten. Because you were the first person in 3 years who made me feel like myself again. Not James Valor, not just Maya's dad, just Nate. Flawed and uncertain and trying his best. You sat across from me and didn't want anything except company and coffee and comfortable silence. I couldn't risk losing that. I couldn't risk watching you look at me differently once you knew. But I did look at you differently, Charlie said softly. That's what you were afraid of, and it happened anyway. I know. So what do we do now? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. I don't know what we do now, Nate admitted. I just know that losing you, losing this, he gestured at the table, the cafe, the space they'd created together, that would be worse than any of the exposure or judgment or media attention. You matter to me, Charlie, more than anonymity, more than safety. You matter. Charlie's face crumpled slightly and she pulled her hand back to wipe at her eyes. You matter to me too. That's why this hurts so much. That's why I couldn't just dismiss it as a harmless omission. You became important, Nate. You became necessary. And then I found out you'd been holding back the biggest part of your story. I wasn't holding back, Nate said. I was protecting. There's a difference. Is there? Charlie challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, they look pretty similar. Both involve keeping secrets. Both involve deciding what the other person can handle. Both involve choosing control over vulnerability. Nate flinched at the accuracy of her words. You're right. I'm sorry. I thought I was being careful. I was actually just being a coward. You're not a coward, Charlie said firmly. Cowards don't walk away from billions to raise their daughters. Cowards don't agree to attend hostile family weddings to support someone they barely know. Cowards don't sit here and admit their mistakes without making excuses. She took a shaky breath. You're brave, Nate. You're just also scared. Those things can exist together. Are you still angry at me? Nate asked quietly. Charlie considered this. Yes and no. Mostly I'm just sad that we're here instead of where we were when everything felt simple and safe and right. She paused. Do you think we can get back there? I don't know, Nate said honestly. I don't know if we can go back. But maybe. He hesitated, then pushed forward. Maybe we can go forward. Build something new that includes all the truth this time. No more secrets. No more careful omissions. Just honest conversation between two people who matter to each other. That sounds terrifying, Charlie said. It is terrifying, Nate agreed. But so was showing up at your sister's wedding. So was sitting here today knowing you might tell me to leave and never come back. I'm willing to be terrified if it means having you in my life. Charlie stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she stood up abruptly. Come on. Where are we going? Outside. I need air. I need to move. I can't process this sitting still. She grabbed her coffee and headed for the door without waiting to see if Nate would follow. He followed. Of course, he followed. They walked down the street toward the small park 3 blocks from the cafe. Not touching, not talking. Just moving together through the autumn afternoon. Leaves crunched under their feet. The air smelled like wood smoke and approaching winter. Around them, the neighborhood went about its business. Parents pushing strollers. Teenagers on skateboards. An old man walking a dog that looked older than him. Normal life. The kind Nate had been trying to build for 2 years. The kind Charlie was trying to escape from her family's world. They reached the park and sat on a bench overlooking a playground where children shrieked with joy on swings and slides. Charlie watched them for a while in silence, then spoke without looking at Nate. "When I was 8, my father took me to his office for Bring Your Daughter to Work Day. I thought it would be fun. Playing with desk supplies, meeting his colleagues, seeing where he spent all his time. Instead, he sat me down in his office and gave me a lecture about the importance of the Ashford name, about legacy and responsibility, and how everything we did reflected on the family. I was 8 years old and he was already telling me that I wasn't just Charlie. I was an Ashford, and that came with obligations." Nate listened without interrupting, sensing that Charlie needed to speak her own truth now. "I spent my entire childhood learning that lesson," she continued, "that my worth was tied to my family name, that my choices weren't just about me, they were about appearances and reputation in the family portfolio. Even college was strategic. Stanford Business because that's where Ashfords went. Even my job at the family firm was predetermined. I've never made a single major life decision that was actually mine." She finally turned to look at Nate, her eyes fierce. "Except you. Meeting you, spending time with you, bringing you to that wedding. Those were my choices. Mine, not my mother's, not my father's, not the Ashford family legacies. And then I found out that even that choice might have been partially influenced by who you were without me knowing it. Even my one act of rebellion might have been partially about status and connections without me realizing." "No," Nate said firmly. "That's not true. You didn't know who I was. You made those choices based on who you thought I was. And you were right. Nathaniel Cross is who I am. The quiet guy in the cafe who listens and makes bad jokes and understands what it's like to need anonymity. That person is real. James Valor's bank account doesn't change that." "But it does change things," Charlie insisted. "Not who you are fundamentally, but the context, the options available to you, the safety nets. My mother's apology. That wasn't about you as a person. That was about James Valor's influence. She would never have apologized to regular Nathaniel Cross." "I know," Nate said, "and I hate that. I hate that Victoria Ashford only respects me now that she knows I have money and power. I hate that your family will treat me differently, that strangers will judge our friendship through the lens of net worth. I hate all of it. But—" He paused, gathering courage. "I can't hate the result. Your mother apologizing means you don't have to choose between me and your family. The exposure means I can't hide anymore, which is terrifying but also maybe necessary. And you knowing everything means we can build something real now instead of something based on partial truths." Charlie pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "I asked my mother why she apologized. You know what she said. She said because Charlie was right. I judged that young man based on appearances, and I was wrong. Also, he's James Valor, and we can't afford to alienate someone with that kind of influence." Both reasons in the same breath. Like they were equally important. "Which one do you believe?" Nate asked. "Both," Charlie said with a bitter laugh. "That's the thing about my mother. She's never just one thing. She's capable of genuine reflection and calculated strategy at the same time. She probably did realize she'd been unfair to you. And she definitely realized that being connected to James Valor is good for the family business. Those truths coexist." "Like how I'm both Nate and James," Nate said. "Both truths coexisting." "Exactly." Charlie rested her chin on her knees. "I think that's what I'm struggling with. I want things to be simple. Good or bad, honest or deceptive, real or fake. But nothing's that clean. You're a good person who kept secrets, I'm angry at you, but I also miss you. Your wealth is both a privilege and a burden. My family is both toxic and the only family I have. Everything's complicated. Welcome to being human, Nate said gently. Population everyone who's paying attention. Charlie surprised him by laughing. A real laugh, not bitter or sarcastic. Is that what you tell Maya when she's upset? Sometimes. Usually, I just make pancakes and hope for the best. Does it work? Pancakes solve more problems than you'd think. They sat in comfortable silence for a while watching the children play, letting the tension between them ease gradually. Nate thought about all the conversations they'd had in the cafe. All the careful trust they'd built over Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. It had felt fragile then. It felt even more fragile now, damaged by secrets and exposure and misunderstanding. But maybe fragile things could be stronger than they seemed. Maybe the cracks were where the light got in. Maybe relationships that survived rupture became more resilient because they'd learned how to break and rebuild. I have a condition, Charlie said abruptly. If we're going to try to be friends again, real friends, no secrets, no careful omissions, I have a condition. Okay, Nate said carefully. What is it? You have to let me see all of you. Not just Nathaniel Cross, the single dad. Not just James Valor, the investor. All of it. The parts you're proud of and the parts you're ashamed of. The choices you regret and the things you'd do again. I need to know the whole person, not just the version you think I can handle. Nate felt his chest tighten. That's asking a lot. I know. I'm asking anyway. Charlie turned to face him fully. Because I've spent my whole life with people who showed me edited versions of themselves. My parents, my colleagues, even Tori to some extent. Everyone performs. Everyone curates. I thought you were different. Turns out you were just better at hiding the performance. That's not fair. It's completely fair, Charlie interrupted. You performed normalcy. You curated anonymity. You gave me the version of yourself you thought would be acceptable. That's still performance, Nate. It's just a different kind. Nate wanted to argue but couldn't. She was right. He'd been so focused on not being James Valor that he'd created another persona. Nathaniel Cross, the humble single dad who wanted nothing except peace and pancakes. That version was true, but it wasn't complete. It was carefully constructed to avoid judgment and protect his daughter and keep people from asking too many questions. It was still a wall, just a different kind of wall. You're right, Nate said quietly. I've been performing. Not lying exactly, but definitely curating. Showing you only the parts I thought you'd accept. He met her eyes. What if you see all of me and decide I'm not worth knowing? Then at least I'll have made that decision based on truth, Charlie said. But Nate, I've seen you with your daughter. I've heard how you talk about her. I've watched you sacrifice your comfort to support someone you barely knew. I've sat across from you for hours and felt safer than I've felt in years. All of that was real. So maybe there are parts of you I won't like. Maybe I'll struggle with some of your choices or judge some of your privileges. But I don't think I'll decide you're not worth knowing. I think I'll just know you better. What about you? Nate asked. Do I get to see all of you too? That's only fair, Charlie agreed. Though I should warn you, all of me includes someone who's struggling to figure out if she even wants to stay at her family's firm. Someone who lies awake at night wondering if she's wasted her entire life living someone else's plan. Someone who's angry and scared and tired of pretending to be fine when she's not. I already knew all that, Nate said gently. You told me most of it over coffee. The difference is now we're naming it clearly instead of talking around it. Naming things makes them real, Charlie said. Things were already real. We're just being honest about them now. Charlie nodded slowly, something settling in her expression. Okay. We try this. Real friendship. Complete honesty. No more walls or performances or carefully curated versions. Just us, messy and complicated and figuring it out as we go. Just us, Nate agreed. Messy and complicated. They shook hands solemnly like they were sealing a contract and then both laughed at the formality of the gesture. But something had shifted. The anger and hurt hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd been acknowledged and examined and made room for now. There was space to rebuild. As they stood to leave the park, Charlie's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went pale. "What's wrong?" Nate asked. Charlie showed him the screen. An email from her mother with a news article attached. The headline read, "Amanda Cross files for emergency custody of daughter Maya, citing father's reckless return to public life." Nate's blood ran cold. Nate stared at the headline on Charlie's phone, the words blurring together as panic seized his chest. Amanda Cross files for emergency custody. His ex-wife, who called Maya once a month if they were lucky, was using his exposure as James Valor to take his daughter away. "I have to go," Nate said, already pulling out his own phone. "I need to call my lawyer. I need to breathe," Charlie said firmly, her hand on his arm. "Breathe first. Then we call David. Then we fight this together." Nate looked at her. This woman who'd been angry at him less than an hour ago, who had every reason to walk away from his increasingly complicated life. And she was saying we. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Charlie's voice was steel. "You showed up for me when I needed someone. I'm showing up for you now. That's what friends do. Real friends." They walked back to Nate's car and he called David from the parking lot. Charlie stood beside him close enough that he could hear David's voice on the speaker. "I just saw the filing," David said without preamble. "It's garbage, Nate, but it's garbage we have to take seriously. Amanda's lawyers are arguing that your return to public life as James Valor puts Maya at risk. Unwanted media attention disruption to her stable home environment. Your, quote, inability to maintain consistent identity and priorities. That's insane. That's expensive lawyers spinning a narrative." David's voice was grim. "They're also claiming that your voluntary poverty, their exact words, constitutes a form of emotional neglect when you have the resources to provide better." Nate felt sick. "What do I do? We document everything. Maya's grades, her happiness, your involvement in her life. We gather testimony from teachers, neighbors, anyone who can speak to your relationship with her. We show the court that your choices, however unconventional they might seem, are deliberate and in Maya's best interest." David paused. "And we prepare for a fight. The hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from Monday. Amanda's pushing for expedited review, claiming immediate risk to the child." After hanging up, Nate slumped against his car. 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks to prove he was a good father, to defend choices he'd made to protect Maya, to fight for the right to keep being her dad. Charlie was already texting. "I'm canceling my afternoon. We're going to your place, and we're building your case. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every moment that proves you're exactly the father Maya needs. Charlie, don't argue. You said you wanted to show me all of you no walls. Well, this is part of it. Let me help." They spent the rest of Thursday afternoon and all of Friday in Nate's small apartment building the case like Charlie was orchestrating a military campaign. She made lists, organized documents, drafted witness requests with the precision of someone who'd spent years in corporate strategy. Maya came home from Emma's playdate Friday evening to find her dining table covered in papers. "Are you worried about Mom trying to take me away?" she asked directly, standing in the doorway with her backpack. Nate and Charlie exchanged glances. There was no point in lying. Maya had probably overheard his phone call with David anyway. "Yes," Nate admitted. I'm worried, but we're working on making sure that doesn't happen. Good. Maya dropped her backpack and walked over to the table. Because I don't want to live with Mom. I want to stay here. With you, with our home, with our life. She looked at Charlie. With our Tuesday-Thursday cafe friend who's helping us fight. You might have to tell that to a judge, Nate said carefully. If this goes to court. I already decided, Maya said, with the certainty only an 8-year-old could muster. I decided 2 years ago when we left. I decided every day since when you make breakfast and ask about school and actually listen. Mom gives me stuff, you give me you, that's better. Nate pulled his daughter into a hug, his throat tight. Charlie looked away politely, giving them their moment, but not before Nate saw her wiping at her own eyes. Thank you for helping us, Maya said to Charlie when Nate finally released her. You're helping right every step of the way, Charlie promised. Good, because you're part of our family now, and families protect each other. Over the next 3 weeks, they built a case that told the truth about Nate's life. His dedication to Maya, the stability he'd created from scratch, the community he'd built in their modest neighborhood. Sarah, from Chapter and Brew, wrote a letter about Nate's consistency, how he'd been a fixture at the cafe for 6 months, how his commitment to routine spoke to someone focused on creating stability for his daughter. Mrs. Chen provided testimony about the countless times she'd seen Nate prioritize Maya, the parent-teacher conferences he never missed, the science fair project he'd helped with until midnight, the way Maya lit up every time he picked her up from school. Maya's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, wrote glowing reports about Maya's academic performance, her social adjustment, her obvious emotional security. Even Derek Montgomery contributed writing a character reference that carried significant weight. A respected CEO describing Nate as the most thoughtful person I've known, someone whose choices reflect deep integrity rather than instability. Charlie coordinated everything, made phone calls, scheduled meetings, took notes, sat beside Nate during late-night preparation sessions when panic threatened to overwhelm him. You're going to win this, she said one night when they were reviewing testimony at midnight. Maya was asleep in her room. The apartment was quiet except for the rustle of papers. You don't know that. I do know that. Charlie looked at him across the cluttered table. Because any judge with eyes can see what kind of father you are, and because I won't let Amanda take Maya away, not when Maya so clearly belongs here. The hearing arrived on a gray Monday morning in early November. Nate stood on the courthouse steps in his Navy suit, the same one from the wedding, and tried to control his breathing. Charlie stood beside him in professional clothes, every inch the sterling daughter, despite having officially resigned from Ashford Financial the week before. I quit, she'd told him matter-of-factly over Coffee Tuesday. Told my parents I was starting a non-profit focused on adult literacy. Mother handled it better than expected. Said if I was determined to throw away my future, at least I could do it usefully, which for her is basically a blessing. Now she squeezed his hand. You've got this. The evidence is overwhelming. Maya loves you. You're a good father. That's all that matters. What if it's not enough? Then we appeal, and we keep fighting. But Nate, it's going to be enough. They entered the courtroom. Amanda was already there with her legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits. She looked exactly as Nate remembered. Beautiful, polished, every hair in place. She glanced at him across the room with cold calculation. She'd expected him to settle, to accept whatever terms she offered rather than fight publicly. She'd underestimated how much he loved Maya. The hearing took 4 hours. Amanda's lawyers painted a picture of instability. A man who'd walked away from billions in what they called a mental breakdown. who lived in voluntary poverty despite having resources, who'd exposed his daughter to unwanted media scrutiny through his attention-seeking return to investing. They implied his friendship with Charlie was inappropriate, suggested his choices were reckless, argued that Maya deserved the stability and resources only Amanda could provide. Nate sat there and listened to his life being twisted into something unrecognizable. Listened to his decision to prioritize his daughter over wealth being characterized as neglect. Listened to his attempt to build a meaningful life being dismissed as delusion. Then his lawyer presented the evidence. Letters from teachers describing Maya's happiness. Testimony from neighbors about Nate's dedication. Report cards showing academic excellence. Photos of father-daughter moments. Science fair projects and playground visits and breakfast for dinner traditions. Derek's statement carried particular weight. A respected CEO describing Nate as someone who saved my company with no expectation of recognition, whose choices reflect deep integrity rather than instability. The contrast was stark. Amanda offering material resources, Nate offering himself. Charlie sat in the gallery behind Nate exactly where he could see her if he turned around. A constant reminder that he wasn't alone in this. The judge called a recess to review the documentation. Nate stepped outside with Charlie, his hand shaking from adrenaline and fear. "You did great," Charlie said firmly. "Your lawyer was clear. The documentation is strong." Maya's voice came through in every piece of evidence. "What if it's not enough?" Nate whispered. "It will be enough. It has to be, because the alternative is unthinkable." Charlie took both his hands. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. That's what we do now." The judge returned after 30 minutes that felt like 30 years. Everyone stood. Nate's heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his chest. "I've reviewed all documentation and testimony presented today," the judge said, her voice measured and professional. "This is a difficult case because both parents clearly love their daughter and want what's best for her. However, custody decisions must be based on the child's best interests, not parental preferences." Nate held his breath. "Mr. Cross, your life choices may seem unconventional to some. Walking away from significant wealth, choosing a modest lifestyle despite having resources, returning to public investing after years of privacy. These decisions raise questions." The judge paused, and Nate felt time slow. However, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that these choices were made thoughtfully and in your daughter's best interest. Every person who interacts with you and Maya describes a child who is happy, well-adjusted, thriving academically and socially, and deeply bonded with her father. She turned to Amanda. "Ms. Cross, your concerns about media exposure are noted. However, the evidence shows minimal impact on Maya's daily life. Your own absence from that daily life is well documented. While you can certainly provide material resources, that alone does not constitute stability or emotional support." Nate's hands were clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. "My ruling is that current custody arrangements will remain in place. Mr. Cross retains primary custody. Ms. Cross's visitation schedule remains unchanged unless both parties agree to modifications. This ruling can be revisited if circumstances materially change, but based on current evidence, Maya is clearly thriving in her father's care." The gavel came down. "This hearing is adjourned." Nate's knees went weak with relief. Charlie caught his arm, steadying him, her face split in a wide smile. Across the courtroom, Amanda's expression was cold fury, but Nate didn't care. He'd won. Maya got to stay with him. Their life continued. Outside the courthouse, Nate immediately called Mrs. Chen. "We won," he said, his voice breaking. She stays with me. Nothing changes. Of course you won, Mrs. Chen said practically. Anyone with eyes can see you're a good father. Now come pick up your daughter. She's been worried sick. Nate and Charlie drove together to Mrs. Chen's house. When they arrived, Maya burst through the door and ran straight into Nate's arms. We won, she asked against his chest. We won. You're staying with me. Nothing changes. Maya pulled back, tears streaming down her face, and hugged him so tight his ribs might crack. Then she reached out and pulled Charlie into the embrace too. The three of them stood on Mrs. Chen's porch, holding each other like they were the only solid things in a shifting world. Thank you, Maya said to Charlie, for helping Dad, for being our friend, for being part of our family. Thank you for letting me be part of it. Charlie said, her voice thick with emotion. You two are the best thing that's happened to me in years. 2 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, Nate sat at their table in Chapter and Brew. Outside, spring was beginning to win its battle against winter. Buds on trees, temperatures climbing, that particular quality of light that promised warmer days ahead. Charlie walked in right at 2:30, and Nate felt his heart do that complicated thing it had been doing for months now. Friendship had somehow shifted into something more, had grown roots deeper than either of them had planned, had become essential in ways that went beyond companionship. She sat across from him with coffee and that smile that meant she had news. The nonprofit is officially registered, Charlie said. We have our 501c3 status, our first grant funding, enough volunteers to start 3 adult literacy programs next month. It's real, Nate. It's actually real. That's incredible, Nate said, meaning it. You built something meaningful from scratch. That's not easy. I learned from watching you, Charlie said. You rebuilt your entire life on your own terms. That takes courage. I just needed someone to show me it was possible. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Nate thought about how much had changed since that first Tuesday when a tired woman in an oversized sweatshirt had asked if the seat across from him was taken, how they'd built trust in 45-minute increments, how that trust had fractured and been carefully repaired, how they'd learned to be honest even when honesty was terrifying. I need to tell you something, Nate said. Charlie looked up immediately, alert. Good something or bad something? Good something, I hope. Nate took a breath. These Tuesday and Thursday meetings, they're not enough anymore. I look forward to them all week and then they're over too fast. I spend the days between thinking about things I want to tell you or show you or share with you, and I realized somewhere along the way you stopped being just my friend. You became my best friend. You became someone I can't imagine my life without. You became essential, Charlie finished softly. You became essential to me, too. Nate reached across the table and took her hand. So, I'm asking carefully because I don't want to ruin what we have, but also, honestly, because we promised no more walls. Would you want to try being more than friends? Would you want to build something together that includes all the Tuesday-Thursday meetings, but also weekends and holidays and just regular life? Would you want to be part of what Maya and I have built here? Charlie's eyes were bright with tears. I've been wanting to ask you the same thing for months. I was terrified. What if I was reading things wrong? What if you just wanted friendship? What if pushing for more meant losing everything? So we've both been scared, Nate said with a soft laugh. So we've both been scared, Charlie agreed. But you know what? We've been scared before, and we survived it. We can be scared about this too and survive it. We can build something real and messy and complicated and worth the risk. Is that a yes? That's the most definite yes I've ever given to anything. Charlie squeezed his hand. Yes, to more than friendship. Yes to building something together. Yes to being part of your and Maya's life in whatever way makes sense. Yes to all of it. Nate stood up, walked around the table, and pulled Charlie into a hug right there in the middle of the cafe. Sarah saw them from behind the counter and actually cheered. "Finally, I've been waiting for you two to figure this out for months." The college students in the corner looked up and smiled. The retired couple gave them a knowing nod. Nate and Charlie pulled apart, both laughing and crying, and feeling exactly like people do when something fragile becomes solid, when something possible becomes real, when something worth protecting is finally being built with intention and honesty, and no walls left between. 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, Nate and Charlie sat at their table in Chapter and Brew exactly like they had 100 times before. Except now they held hands openly instead of secretly under the table. Now they kissed goodbye when one of them left. Now they made plans that extended beyond just the next meeting. Maya was starting 3rd grade and had decided she wanted to study marine biology. Charlie's nonprofit had expanded to 5 locations and was being profiled in the State Education Journal. Nate's investment portfolio included 12 companies, all focused on impact over returns, attracting attention from other ethical investors who wanted to prioritize people over profits. Everything had changed. Everything was exactly the same. They still met Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2:30, still sat at the same table, still ordered the same coffee, still honored the ritual that had started everything. "I have something for you," Charlie said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it across the table. Nate opened it carefully. Inside was a framed photo, one he'd never seen before. It showed their table at the cafe empty except for 2 coffee cups, afternoon light streaming through the window, the reading, quote, visible on the brick wall behind the chairs. "Sarah took it months ago," Charlie explained. "Before the wedding, before everything fell apart, before we learned how to be honest with each other. She said she'd never seen 2 people look more like they'd found home in an unexpected place. I wanted you to have it, a reminder of where we started." Nate stared at the photo, at the simple composition that somehow captured everything they'd built. 2 coffee cups on a worn table. Light and shadow. The promise of connection in an anonymous space. "It's perfect," he said. "We're perfect," Charlie corrected. "Not in the everything's easy way, in the everything's worth fighting for way, in the we've survived hard things and chose each other anyway way." "That's the best kind of perfect," Nate agreed. They sat there as the afternoon light shifted, and the cafe filled and emptied and filled again. 2 people who'd needed to hide had found each other in a bookstore cafe and built something real out of coffee and honesty and the courage to be fully known. 2 people who'd been performing different versions of themselves had learned how to exist without walls. 2 people who'd been running from their pasts had figured out how to walk forward into futures they were building together. Sarah brought them refills without being asked. The college students studied in their corner. The retired couple shared their scone, the familiar rhythm of Chapter and Brew continuing around them like a heartbeat. No more secrets. No more walls. No more pretending. Just Nate and Charlie choosing each other completely right where they started, in a corner booth at Chapter and Brew, where reading is dreaming with open eyes, and where 2 people had finally woken up to something real. The best stories don't end. They just keep beginning. If this story reminded you that real connection is worth fighting for, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what part resonated with you most. And subscribe, because I love sharing stories about people who choose authenticity over perfection, courage over comfort, and love over fear. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Thank you for being here, for staying until the end, and for believing that sometimes the best things in life start with a simple question. Is anyone sitting here? See you in the next story.